Welcome to Reality Check, a deep dive into your privacy in XR. Extended reality environments are made possible by multiple sensors and technical processes acting in concert to process a diverse array of data about the user and their surrounding environment. These data flows power the functions that enable immersive experiences, but can raise privacy and data protection concerns for both users and bystanders. In this presentation, we will analyze what these data flows look like and identify where privacy issues may emerge, such as how applications of artificial intelligence, including generative AI, can contribute to these challenges by enabling manipulation and inferences about sensitive user information. And two, we want to draw attention to how existing and future privacy and data protection laws may interact with XR technologies. I have with me today Daniel Berrick and Brittan Heller. Daniel of the Policy Council for the Future of Privacy Forum, and Brittan as counsel from the Atlantic Council. Daniel is a policy counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum. His work involves analyzing complex consumer and commercial privacy law and policy issues, including sector and technology-specific areas such as immersive technologies, open banking, and biometrics. In this role, Daniel collaborates with industry peers and the wider privacy community to identify and develop best practices for data privacy. He received his JD from Duke University Law School, cum laude, and his BA from Hamilton College. Daniel obtained a CIPP/US certification in recognition of his knowledge of US privacy law. We're also joined by Brittan Heller, counsel for the Atlantic Council. Brittan Heller works at the intersection of technology, human rights, and the law. She is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with the Digital Forensics Research Lab, examining XR's connection to society, human rights, privacy, and security. She is also on the steering committee for the World Economic Forum's Metaverse Governance Initiative. She is an affiliate at the Yale Information Society Project and the Stanford Program on Democracy and the Internet, and a researcher at the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. That's awesome. Heller was an inaugural AI and technology fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, studying content moderation and security risks in AR, VR, XR, and emergent media, which resulted in award-winning publications on privacy, biometrics, targeted advertising, and XR. Heller is a frequent speaker and commentator on XR issues and has published in The Information, Wired, The New York Times, and The Hill on online harms. She also advises governments and top XR companies on how to build safer and more inclusive immersive spaces. As former counsel in Foley Hoag LLP's global business and human rights practice, Heller advised companies, investors, and NGOs on integrating public safety and human rights. She previously founded ADL Center for Technology and Society. Her key projects included creating AI to study hate speech and XR experiences for civil rights advocacy. Additionally, Heller prosecuted grave human rights violations at the U.S. Department of Justice and International Criminal Court and initiated landmark anti-cyber harassment litigation. She is a graduate of Stanford University and Yale Law School. Fantastic having you both. I'll get out of your way and let you get started. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you so much for those really lovely and comprehensive introductions. I didn't know some of those things. That's really impressive.
You didn't know?
Not all those things, no. That was impressive.
But you do know I have 2 cats, so that's actually more relevant these days.
You should include that in bio.
I should.
Well, hello everyone. I'll be very brief. As I said, my name is Daniel Berrick, Policy Counsel at Future Privacy Forum. For those that don't know, that's an organization which is committed to analyzing the privacy law and policy implications of new technologies. And among the areas that we focus on are immersive technologies like XR. And we're really thrilled today to be presenting to you to talk more about some of the privacy law and policy issues that are associated with XR and some of the ways that organizations and companies can think about mitigating and preventing some of those risks. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Brittan to do some audience engagement questioning stuff.
All right, so I'm a professor, and I'm going to start with a couple caveats and then a couple questions.
Yes.
Number one, dear readers, this is not legal advice. To protect my bar license and Daniel's bar license,
yes.
If you have questions about how the law applies to you, your particular product or service, or your company, ask a real lawyer. Please seek out legal counsel.
Please.
And second
thing, yeah. I can say it.
Yeah.
So one of the things we would like to disclose is that everything that we say in the context of this presentation represents the views of us as individuals and not those of our organizations, including Future Privacy Forum, Stanford University, and the Atlantic Council. Did I hear everything?
I think that's it.
Phenomenal. Very good. Now time for some questions.
All right. So I know a bunch of the people here, so I may know if you're fibbing, but have you thought about privacy when designing your XR products, services, or experiences? If so, raise your hand.
Interesting. Very encouraging.
Do you consider privacy from the outset as you're developing even your initial idea? Yeah, thank you.
There you go.
Do you think that recent or upcoming XR products, services, or experiences will require new kinds of data?
I hope not, but probably.
Chris, can you expound on that a little bit?
I think as we continue to enter into developing new frameworks, develop new frameworks, there is going to be new onsets of data, because the data that they're working with right now on more of a horizontal fashion, when we look at regenerative pre-trained transformers, are widely scrapped from the worldwide internet. But as we begin to verticalize, when we look at these individual siloed GPTs, generative pre-trained transformers, it's really deriving from a source of human intelligentsia that we probably never tapped into. Therefore, the converting it into usable and distributed data will change, and it'll need new safeguards in place to be able to deal with that. And so right now I think it's in an abstract state that's headed to more of a concrete state, but it'll need to be defined as a different type of data that we've never experienced before.
Good.
And then, Michael, did you have anything to add to that? Do you feel like you're in law school?
This is a cold call simulation.
It is.
I just was mesmerized by the response. I lost myself. So the question, new kind. Yes, absolutely. We're with mixed reality headsets and new AR technology. We're going to be required to give up scans of our personal environments. And so if you think about, like, what does your bedroom look like, how messy or clean it is, it's going to become personally identifying data, because within your bedroom is probably your sexuality, your gender, and your family history and your secrets. And then we're going to require that data to generate your extended reality, mixed reality, augmented world space. And so I think that's a hidden danger that we're not addressing yet, certainly not at a policy level. And biometrics, of course.
Oh, well, we'll be talking about plenty of biometrics, don't you worry.
Well, thank you, Michael. Yeah, that was and then Chris, that makes my brain run. But yeah, the biometrics parts of like the privacy and like the retina scans, and even with like the EQs coming out with the ability to scan, like emulate your motor skills as well. So yeah, that is new data stacks. And to Chris's point, the vertical instead of horizontal data with the so many silos of those individualized LLDs like sets. I think that's a good idea. Especially too, I'm not sure if we talked about that, but Michael, that's a good point about the sexuality part of like XR. Like somebody can like see you like do things to the camera, like your room, and even like online. Like I don't think anybody's really brought up that in this conference, have we? Like how like the sexuality is going to work, and like the different privacy laws with that. Have we spoke about that here at all?
I'm not sure if we've spoken about it at the conference, but I do know that people at the Future on Privacy Forum have actually done legal analysis of intimate toys and things like that. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah. And there definitely are studies out there with respect to eye tracking specifically, I know, that kind of deal like with particular sensitive insights can be gleaned from those technologies, which may be used in conjunction with XR.
We'll talk about that a little.
Yeah, so we'll go into that for sure. Yeah.
I just wanted a clarification on what you mean by new kinds of data, because we've talked about sensors and biometrics and these things already exist, but there's also sort of how that data is structured and schemas and ways that and of course ways that they're used and the provisions to secure privacy with them. So I'm just wondering what you meant by new kinds.
I think taking information that is pre-existing, but the novel part is the packaging, application, quantification, and commercialization of that type of information.
And that's where my mind went.
Yeah.
So a lot of privacy concerns were raised here, but I want to talk about the crash and burn issues. So when these companies go sideways and they end up sold, right? So you have entire data portfolios getting sold to potentially nefarious actors. And we saw this with OkCupid and Grindr over the past couple of years, where we had like Russians and other countries like literally saying, give us your profile information, we're going to profile these people. It's just the question of like, what are some of the thoughts now, given the fact that, you know, we've had how many metaverse crashes inside of the last year and a half, and how much of the sensitive eye tracking, biometric, and other data is now available either wholesale or has been rolled up, or, you know, some VC is like, I'm going to sell this to Todd, right, for a small amount of money, but, you know, now that the privacy concerns have become syndicated.
So I think that's actually a really good answer to number 3, where we were going to talk about what areas of privacy law do you think are the most applicable and the most misaligned with extended reality. And so you're talking about aspects related to information security and cybersecurity related legal regimes, which I think is actually quite underexplored. When I talk to a lot of my clients, they're very surprised to hear that that AR can actually be a vector for malware.
Fascinating.
And it will look different on an Android phone and an Apple phone.
Yeah, the amount of malware injection you can do right now, like Club Penguin style, is crazy. I mean, where it's going is insane.
Yeah, fascinating. Shall we continue
Yeah.
to the next slide? Awesome.
All right.
Well, first of all, thank you for that, very engaged response, all of you who participated. That was fascinating. So the TLDR of this presentation, what's kind of the big takeaway here that I would like all of you to kind of resonate and take away with? So the big point here is that extended reality technologies rely on vast quantities and various kinds of data in order to deliver on a motley crew of use cases. But in doing so, some of this data may be tied to a particular individual and therefore considered personal data. And furthermore, some of this information, to the points made by people in the audience, could be considered sensitive data, both from a policy and legal point of view. And this poses a variety of different risks to individuals, to bystanders, to members of society. And furthermore, it also raises a variety of compliance obligations and concerns for companies that are operating in this particular space. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to, there we go.
We're going to illustrate it.
We're going to visualize it, if you will. We're going to be kind of running through this infographic slide by slide, first talking about the kinds of data that XR technologies rely upon, categorizing them, and talking about some of the underlying processing activity that makes all of this possible. And just to let you know, I do have physical copies of that infographic, so I'm happy to provide that to you, which are down there, but I will be sure to give it to you at the end. And in addition to talking about those underlying processing activities, the sensors, the data, we'll also be then pivoting to talk about the risks, both of a legal and policy nature, before concluding this presentation by talking about some of the measures that companies and organizations can take to mitigate and prevent some of the privacy challenges that we identified, and then opening up to further Q&A. But without further ado, let's pivot to the first part of this presentation, which focuses on the various kinds of data that power XR. And the way we've done it at FPF is we've categorized it into 3 or 4 separate categories, including sensor data, usage and telemetry data, device data, and location data. But we're going to start off with the first 2 here.
And may I ask, Laura, if we can pass out the graphics to the people in the audience?
Sure,
because the 4 kinds of data are actually color-coded. Future on Privacy Forum does an excellent job of taking very complex processes and literally drawing them out. So this is the type of thing that gets given to regulators, legislators, companies, businesses to help them understand.
Yeah, because a big challenge that we've encountered when interacting with our stakeholders, even those that are making products and applications in this space, is sure the engineers have a lexicon and way of communicating these challenges, but then there can be internal inter-team breakdowns when they're trying to explain the various risks and legal issues to one another. So what we try to do is create some of that shared language that can be the initiator of those kinds of conversations. And so with the data types, as I said, we have these 4 categories, and the first 2 we've illustrated here are sensor data and usage and telemetry data. And the first category, sensor data, as the name would imply, is data that is gathered from sensors which are located on or connected in some way to the device. For a good example, would be cameras that are either inward or outward-facing cameras, as well as things like inertial measurement units, which capture things like device velocity, orientation, and similar kinds of data, as well as even microphones, which, while they can certainly enable user-to-user interactions, they can, in some applications, allow for spatial mapping. And as such, sensor data is quite integral to some really core XR functions, including positional tracking. And by that, I mean the ability to situate a device and controllers, for example, within a particular environment vis-a-vis virtual content, for example. And that's something that's relevant across the spectrum, whether we're talking about VR, MR, or AR. And as such, it's very integral to XR functionalities. And another kind of data to think about is usage and telemetry data. This is data by no means that is specific to XR. Your phones and specifically the applications on them gather this kind of data, and this can reveal things like how long were you in a particular game on your XR headset, what content you were viewing with respect to a particular experience. And there are a variety of different reasons that companies may want this data, from collecting it to address various software crashes and bugs, to enabling various kinds of tracking and profiling in conjunction with other kinds of data, which I'll go over in the next slide. So as I mentioned, there are two other categories of data that you should be thinking about, and these include XR device data and location data. Again, not specific to XR, but nonetheless quite important to delivering various XR use cases and technologies. When we think about XR device data, these include things like hardware and software information, identifiers, and IP addresses. And historically, you could use this information in conjunction with things like the usage and telematics data in the context of mobile phones and other kinds of technologies to create profiles around users and make various kinds of inferences about that person's likes and dislikes and other preferences. Finally, you have location data. And this is information that indicates a device's approximate or precise geographic position. And kind of similar to sensor data, it can be very integral to enabling a variety of XR-specific use cases. So namely, if you have a geofence, for example, an AR experience, that experience needs to know when you cross into a particular geofence so as to, and Pokemon, I think, goes a great example of this, if you want to have a fight against Charizard in the gym next door, it needs to know where you are vis-a-vis that gym in order for that use case to work. So those kind of represent the kinds of data that we're thinking about when we're understanding what the privacy risks and legal risks are. But with all that said, I'm going to now pivot over to Brittan to talk more about the underlying processes.
So it's one thing to understand the types and qualities of data flows that go in and out of XR devices. And I think the other piece of the puzzle that I know several of the people here are very familiar with coming from an engineering background, but we're going to spell it out very explicitly for all the kids at home. We're going to talk about how data processing systems are powered by XR. And after you collect data, how it's processed by various algorithms and automated systems to turn that data into information with utility. And maybe that's a good definition of what we're talking about, new types of information, or new types of data, information with utility. So this type of processing will depend on the collecting or processing, or what the entity that's collecting or processing the information plans to use the data for. But there's a few generalized systems that are used to power XR. Number one is the SLAM algorithm, simultaneous location and mapping, along with concurrent odometry and mapping, COM. So these are algorithms that map users' surrounding areas, including the placement of landmarks, or map points, and help determine whether a user should be positioned in one place or another within a virtual environment. Positional tracking in XR can change the viewpoint of the user. It can reflect different actions like jumping or ducking or leaning forward. It can allow for an exact representation of a user's hands and other objects in the virtual environment. It can increase the connection between the physical and the virtual world, like, for example, using hand position to move virtual objects by touch, or detect gestures by analyzing position over time. A specific example of SLAM and COM algorithms are when sensors in the headset Note the tilt and location of a user's head on X, Y, and Z axes, so forward and backwards, up and down, and left-right movement. And this is used to keep the orientation of the display as accurate as possible as the user moves through virtual space. Next, we can use computer vision AI-based systems. And what these do is they help to identify and place specific objects within a virtual environment. And this includes virtual objects that will respond to changes in the environment caused by adjustments to the user's perspective. There are 4 different methods that computer vision uses to do this. One is called salient point and blob detection. And this is getting really, really into the weeds, but we promised you a deep dive. So this uses a so-called salient point, which is a small area in an image with some indiscriminate features, so fuzzy wuzzy, that's different from the rest of the image. And then so that's a salient point, but the blob is a region of an image that has some properties that are constant or almost constant. The detected blobs are commonly used for peak detection, texture analysis, or recognition. Second is scaled space methods. So this looks at an object through different scales of the same image instead of looking at it through fixed windows, so bigger or smaller. Next are template matching methods, and this is what's commonly used with facial detection algorithms. How does your facial geometry match up to the template? It relies on pre-existing templates, and so the biggest limitation for this is the maximum number of templates that can be stored, analyzed, or acquired. And finally, computer vision works by edge and boundary detection. And so this method detects sharp changes in image brightness to determine distinctive objects and their surroundings. An example of computer vision is it allows machines to recognize and understand visuals just like humans. So in AR, this can help us build more accurate environments and enable detection and identification of things and locating real-world elements. The same will occur and perhaps be more prevalent as we move into mixed reality or pass-through. Next, we have sensor fusion, and I think that might be one back. One back? One back. No, it's not one back. So sensor fusion is another way that we process through AI all of our XR-related information. And so, in short, sensor fusion is just what it sounds like, a processing activity where algorithms combine data from various sensors to improve the accuracy of a device's mapping system. By using a combination of techniques, one sensor's shortfalls can be accommodated for or kind of augmented by another sensor. Types of tracking that are used in sensor fusion include acoustic tracking, wireless tracking, and inertial tracking, magnetic tracking, and optical tracking. So an example of sensor fusion that is very common in these devices is when you have a combination of inertial tracking and optical tracking. The former can develop drift, where things kind of move a little bit through the environment, and the latter is susceptible to being thrown off when your markers are hidden. So by combining both, if your markers are occluded, or if the position can then be estimated by inertial trackers. And even if the optical markers are completely visible, the inertial sensors provide updates at a higher rate, improving the overall positional tracking. This is really, really in the weeds stuff. I think next slide will be off-device processing is another aspect of data storage and processing in XR. So data is often processed or on a user's device. And when you look at privacy protective practices, this is actually something that we point to as a best practice to keep the data on the headset. More commonly these days, there's a number of instances where data is being processed by external servers or sent off to remote servers. For instance, a device maker may use this data to improve existing functions, to enable shared experiences with other users, to allow third-party developers to create apps and games on XR devices, and also use that data that they're getting from the third-party developers to power their own devices. There are benefits of off-device data transfers, and this can be enhanced performance, device portability, energy efficiency, scalability, future-proofing, and cost optimization. There's also downsides. So you can see potential increases in latency as you have to move information off and onto the devices again. You can see network dependence because it has to be attached to Wi-Fi, which in turn can deepen digital divides. You can see cost going up because you have to use cloud services or remote server infrastructure. You can also see privacy and security implications. So off-device processing requires you to transfer data from the headset to a remote server. And this raises concerns about the security of your XR data. It's kind of a balancing act about whether or not you want to do off-device processing. Mostly a balancing act for cost, latency, performance, but not necessarily for privacy and security because it does increase the risk necessarily.
That cuts both ways.
It does.
If you're doing the processing on the device that backs on the environment, that means that the server is providing information which provides more information to the device than the device necessarily needs. And so it exposes providing information from the server to the device. So it goes both ways.
That's a good point.
That's a great point. And I think it fits in really well with best practices for data minimization and privacy.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really salient point to make regarding that there are tensions sometimes between the needs of certain processing use cases and what, would be recommended as the best practice when it comes to privacy. And I think on-device, versus off-device processing is a really good embodiment of that. I'm sure people have worn kind of like early versions of AR glass form factors where they try to do a lot of stuff on the device and it feels like you're plunging your face into a campfire because, the device is like processing so much and it gets very hot and it doesn't have the means to do it. And that's why off-device processing may be better for some of the reasons. But again, there are privacy downsides to that.
So let's talk a little more about the next slide, which is privacy, data protection, and other concerns related to XR. So from shared experiences to expressive avatars, XR technologies need to collect, process, and transfer personal data to other parties in order to work. However, these data flows may also raise the following privacy and data protection considerations. Number one, and the one that I care a lot about and I've written extensively about, is sensitive inferences. So many of the aforementioned cases that we've talked about rely on data that can help infer characteristics about individuals. If you look at pupillometry, for example, you can actually determine somebody's sexual preferences, different types of medical conditions they may have, like preclinical signs of schizophrenia, ADHD, Parkinson's, and Huntington's disease, or their propensity to be telling the truth. And this is all information you can get from your pupil dilation. That's needed to help calibrate your device and prevent you from feeling sick in the environment and to actually decrease latency and make the device work. But it is data that can give insights into your innermost thoughts, desires, and even medical conditions you may not be aware that you have yourself. Newer devices utilize EMGs, ocular movement, or micro-movements to help determine your intentions and preferences. For example, wanting to move a mouse, or selecting one icon or option over another before you even engage your limbs in movement. So it tracks the electrical impulses that come from thinking about moving my arm and intercepts them before they hit my hand. Related to all of this, depending on how the data is used, applied, stored, etc., is a potential loss of anonymity. The sheer volume and variety of the types of data that we have in XR technologies could enable something akin to a digital fingerprinting. This would make it more challenging for users and others to maintain anonymity in digital environments and could discourage individuals from engaging in certain types of conduct, or speech or producing certain types of content. And to give you examples from the world of academia, there are two studies that I turn to that help you understand how your movement can uniquely identify you, especially in an XR environment. So in 2020, the Balanson lab that I'm a part of at Stanford did a study, and they found that you could be uniquely identified from 5 minutes of data in XR. Out of a pool of about 500 participants, the system was able to positively identify 95% of users correctly when trained on less than 5 minutes of tracking data per person. From the quality of their movements, from the sponginess of your bones, from the length of your...
we're doing the single ladies.
We're doing the single ladies thing. Of your tendons, and from the idiosyncrasies of the way you tilt your head, the way you point, etc. A 2023 Berkeley study that just came out showed a large number of real VR users, so about 55,000 people, and showed that these people could be uniquely and reliably identified across multiple sessions by using just their head and hand motion in relation to virtual objects. After training a classification model on 5 minutes of data, a user could be uniquely identified from 50,000 other users with 94% accuracy from 100 seconds of motion. With 10 seconds of motion, they could be 74%, identified with 74% accuracy. So it's a very real risk that people don't think about, because nobody at this point thinks this is as identifying as my retina scan on my fingerprint, but it actually is. The next is bystander privacy. And while XR technologies collect personal data about individuals, these individuals who are in an AR environment, the individuals in the surrounding environment may lack notice that they are also being tracked and monitored by the AR devices. Current methods of notification are light-based on the stem of eyeglasses or on the bridge of eyeglasses when you're talking about AR. However, this can interfere with your XR functionality. If your light is too bright or too large, you quickly deplete your power supply, you suck your processing speed, or you can even disable the sensor-based cameras that are needed to orient and position the user in space. Additionally, we were doing the single ladies thing, but there is no shared physical vocabulary at this point to indicate that you are being recorded in an AR environment. This is the reason I brought the phone up, because if I was to walk into a crowd and do this, you're probably aware that I'm taking a picture of you. This, to people, means taking a picture with a static camera. Does this mean anything to most people? Not yet. It means I'm thinking, not I'm recording an image of you with Ray-Bans. So, finally, we have the danger of manipulation, which is becoming more and more salient with the onset and combination of generative AI with XR environments. So in the future, virtual agents powered by generative AI may populate immersive virtual worlds. Who here saw the NVIDIA demo where you were able to go and talk to the NPC bartender in the game? It's super cool. It's like the movie Free Guy, but real. And but by adapting specific interactions powered by AI, based on observations that are made about users, these virtual autonomous agents could tailor responses specifically to a person's mood, to a person's personal history, or to a person's behaviors, or other kind of characteristics that are akin to a digital fingerprint. People think they're smarter than this. If you've seen any of the work by Avi Bar-Zeev, he came to a conference we put on at Stanford and showed how in an XR environment you could actually switch out elements in the environment at blink rate. So users were not aware that they were A/B testing Coke versus Pepsi, potentially. And nobody, unless you slowed it down enough, was aware that that was actually happening. So when I think there's also a risk that consumers think they're smarter than the machine. But at this point, the machines have caught up.
No, absolutely.
This is the fun part.
Yes.
So I'm really pleased to kind of turn it over to Daniel now, because the work that the Future on Privacy Forum has done, basically taking theories and doing a 50-state survey and really making a practical study of all of this is, there's no other word to describe it but awesome. So please take it away.
Cheers. Thanks, Brittan. No, thank you for that comprehensive description. It was very eloquent. Claps are very much deserved, I agree. There you go. Bravo. So we're going to pivot now. We've talked about some of the privacy policy risks that relate to XR technologies and their various use cases. Now we're going to pivot and focus on the legal reality of extended reality. I hope you saw what I did there. Sorry, I just had, so I was very proud of that.
It sounds really good in your accent.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so kind. So, one thing to kind of say at the top of, the hour with respect to these privacy law issues is that, many people say, oh, well, privacy laws, were not created with XR technologies in mind, and therefore these laws do not apply to XR technologies. Well, I'm going to respond to that right now, which is that they're right to say that these laws were not created with XR in mind. Indeed, many of these laws predated XR. With that said, most privacy laws, whether in the United States or abroad, are what we would call technology agnostic. They don't care if the processing of personal data is taking place on a phone, on a laptop, on a remote server, and yes, you guessed it, on an XR device and related technologies. So these laws are very pertinent just at the outset there. What we're about to do is give you some illustrative examples, operative word being examples, of ways in which these laws, these privacy laws, interact with XR technologies. And we're going to start off here with the time we have remaining with biometrics. So the TLDR is that extended reality technologies that process body-based data, and I'll get to what that means in a moment, are very likely going to be covered by US privacy laws, and I'll also unpack what those laws are in a moment. So first off, when I say body-based data, what does that mean? This is a very, broad term. It's an FPF creation, if you will.
It's not a legal term
Not a legal
under
term
any
of art.
jurisdiction, but
No.
it's a very descriptive term to help you understand what is meant.
Precisely, and also to kind of give you kind of a comparison to biometrics, which is a legal term for art. So when we think about body-based data, it's kind of just that. It's data relating to an identified or identifiable person's body. It can include in things like gaze vectors, facial expressions, and gait analysis, for example. Now, when I mention US privacy laws, I'm actually referring to two specific classes of US privacy laws, both at the state level. These include biometric data-specific state laws. The best example of this is Illinois' Biometric Information Privacy Act, or as its friends call it, BIPA, which is very well known because it has something what we call a private right of action, which means that individual litigants, provided they meet various jurisdictional thresholds, can sue under that act. Whereas with most privacy laws, they do have a PRA, but it's much more limited and it relates to things like data breaches, or they don't have any PRA whatsoever, and the attorneys generals of the respective states are in charge of enforcing it. On the other hand, we have other kinds of US privacy laws that are relevant, which we call comprehensive data privacy laws. And how fitting we are in California, because California was the first state to create a comprehensive data privacy law. Some people call it the CCPA as amended by the CPRA. From henceforth, I'll just call it the CPRA for ease of brevity, because I hate acronyms as much as anyone else.
I call it the baby GDPR.
There you go, that's fine. Well, I'll take anything at this point, anything to simplify the lexicon. But essentially, what all these laws do, and the reason we bring them up, is they have these definitions surrounding biometrics. That is typically where the similarities end and the differences begin, because the way in which these laws define biometrics can vary quite significantly. And we're going to identify three axes along which differences exist. The first of these are the kinds of body data that they cover. On the narrow end of the spectrum, you have laws like BIPA, which specifically say that they cover biometric information, provided other legal requirements are met. that are derived from certain things called biometric identifiers, which the statute also defines, and it specifically enumerates a limited number of things that it calls biometric identifiers. And these things can include things like iris scans, they can include things like facial scans and fingerprints. On the other end of the spectrum, you have laws like the Colorado Privacy Act, which is a comprehensive law, and that defines biometric information as information, provided other requirements are met, that is about a person's psychology, about their behavior, about their physiology, and about their biology, and things of that nature. So much, much broader, just looking at that particular framing. There are other differences too between all these laws around carve-outs. So most laws, whether they're biometric specific or comprehensive in nature, specifically have carve-outs for things like photos, recordings of an audio or video nature, as well as data derived from these sources. A good example of that is the recently passed Tennessee comprehensive law. On the other end of the spectrum, though, you have narrower carve-outs, which specifically relate to those kinds of data, but then they say, oh, but if you're using that data for identification purpose, it actually is still a biometric. So those are narrower kinds of carve-outs. And the third axis, and I would say probably the most important one for you to take away as we go into this next part of this analysis of the biometric laws, are requirements relating to the use of data for an identification purpose. Laws like BIPA, for example, when they define biometric information, say to be biometric data, not only do you need to meet all the requirements that I talked about before, but it has to be used for identification purpose. However, there are other laws, including the Colorado Act that I mentioned before, which when they define biometric identifiers, say this is data, wait for it, this is the important word, this is data that can be used for an identification purpose. So the fact that it's not tied to verification and identification at the outset means that a broader kind and amount of data can be covered. Now you're wondering, Daniel, thank you for that very awesome analysis and synthesis of various biometric laws and their various differences, but why is this relevant to XR? Well, here you go. So depending on how these biometric laws define biometrics, that is going to affect the scope of data that's covered by these laws, what obligations companies have, and in the XR context, whether body-based data is going to be covered by them. And at FPF, as Brittan so kindly said, we've kind of undertaken analysis to think through how these laws' definitions of biometrics interact with body-based data that's processed in the XR context. And the two big takeaways we have with this: data like facial templates and iris scans that are used for identification purposes are a shoo-in. In all likelihood, those are going to be considered biometrics. And in the XR context, that may manifest as someone logging on to the XR device, and the device needs to log you on using your biometrics, for example, because it needs particular session parameters to apply that are specific to a user.
Like the facial geometry that we mentioned earlier with the AI processing.
Precisely, that's right. The more kind of interesting take, in my opinion, in terms of like what kinds of data are covered, for some of the broader biometric laws in the United States, these laws will apply to data that is used by facial detection technologies, natural language processing in the case of certain kinds of voice print data, as well as eye tracking. And here's the important phrase: even though those technologies are not used for identification purposes. We primarily base this analysis on our reading of the text of these various laws, as well as case law brought under BIPA. And so what's the big takeaway here? Why does that matter to XR? Well, as I mentioned, all those technologies are typically implicated and used in the context of XR. And it also has implications of things like characterization technology, which are both current and future-facing. And these characterization technologies are things that are capable of making inferences about one's likes and preferences and potentially other characteristics such as sexual orientation, political affiliation, and even medical conditions in certain kinds of applications. And therefore, the takeaway here, the TLDR, if you will, is that these biometric laws, which were crafted with a particular purpose in mind of regulating, in many cases, unique risks posed by identification, can actually apply to a much broader array of information than people who are developing these products and services in the XR space may actually realize. And this approach, this conception of biometrics being quite broad, was recently echoed by the FTC last month when they released a policy statement where they analyzed what biometric information is for purposes of how they enforce Section 5 of the FTC Act, which essentially is the main piece of legislation that the Federal Trade Commission, which is the premier privacy regulator, some would say, in the United States, is in charge of enforcing. And what they said is, one, biometric data includes things like photos, recordings, data derived from those sources. So none of the carve-outs that we've talked about with respect to the state laws, they don't recognize those. That's not within their vocabulary and conception of biometric data. Two, they specifically recognize that characterization technologies can fall within the scope of technologies that use or purport to use biometric information. So right at the outset, they have a much broader conception of what biometric information could be, and that's important to companies as the FTC could use that conception in considering what kinds of data practices they're looking at for being unfair or deceptive trade practices in or affecting state commerce. So that's the biometric spiel. I know we only have 8 minutes, so I'm going to just pivot right to the generative AI stuff because I think that's, based on my time at AWE, I know people love talking about generative AI, so I will oblige you all. Also last month, the FTC was very, very busy. They released a blog post about generative AI and the various, policy risks that these kinds of tools pose, as well as how existing laws impact generative AI usage. And essentially, the big takeaway that they had from that blog post was that these kinds of technologies do carry a risk of manipulation because of various cognitive biases that they may be able to exploit and that humans may place in these tools. And as a result of that, the FTC warned companies, which for the record are most companies that are for-profit in nature, subject to a few exceptions like telecommunications, for example, that to the extent these tools are engaged in manipulative behavior, that could warrant a decision or the determination, I should say, by the FTC that that constitutes an unfair or deceptive trade practice, which means they could bring an enforcement action against those companies if they made that determination. And second of all, they noted that there are particular applications that they are aware of where people are trying to use generative AI in the advertising context. And the use case, I think, particularly in the XR situation, is very clear. The idea, if you're able to get a virtual agent that's powered by generative AI, if it's able to input various data about the user based on the current interaction they're having with that virtual agent, as well as information gathered from other sources at a different time, you could output a particular recommendation that factors in the particular preferences of people. In addition to raising Section 5 concerns regarding unfair and deceptive practices, the FTC noted that if you were to do this, there are various ad disclosure requirements that a company who uses these tools in the context of immersive tech and these immersive virtual worlds needs to be thinking about and needs to be observing. So those are just two examples of how the law, in its many different ways, can implicate at a privacy level XR technologies, and that means that developers need to be thinking about these laws from the outset when they're designing these products and throughout. With the 6 minutes we have remaining, I'm going to pivot to the next and final bit before we launch into our Q&A. So you're probably thinking, Daniel, Brittan, you've outlined a myriad of different risks at a policy level and a legal level for companies to be taking into account. What can we do about it, right, if we want to be responsible actors? And so some of the things that we have here represent some of the best practices that we've identified through our interactions with our stakeholders and our own research that companies may want to take into account when trying to mitigate risk.
And we've mentioned them throughout the talk because these are so important. We didn't want to hide the lead.
Yes. Don't want to hide the lead. That's not a very nice thing to do. One thing I'll just say at the outset here is that companies that go into this kind of mitigation methodology thinking, I do one thing here, I'm good, I've prevented all privacy harms, I strongly doubt that would be the case. In all likelihood, you're going to be needing to do a myriad of these things, whether it's for a policy reason or a legal reason, to ensure that you're effectively mitigating risk. And one thing I'll note at this time, without getting into the specifics here because we have time limits, is that FPF right now recognizes that we can recommend all these best practices all we want, but companies still have the challenge of thinking about how do I actually think from start to finish what my data practices should look like and what kinds of best practices I should adopt to mitigate the kinds of risk. And to that end, we've been working very hard with members of business, with civil society, and even academics to kind of come up with a risk framework that companies use to construct their data practices from start to finish. And it's composed of several different components. One, contextualizing the data flow. So helping companies ask certain questions to learn more and figure out what kinds of data are they using, for what purposes, and with whom they're sharing it. Another thing that we hope to introduce in this framework are a more comprehensive look into the various legal risks, some of which I outlined just now, for companies to be thinking about as they're developing these products and services. And furthermore, also to help companies issue spot when it comes to the kinds of policy risks that they should be thinking about, that the law, as you probably are acutely aware of, does not necessarily address, because the law is always behind technology, but nonetheless is good. Actors, we should be thinking about how to deal with them. We also have a risk framework that companies should take into account when actually trying to balance the benefits and risks posed by these different technologies. And finally, thinking about, okay, well, based on those risks, what's the appropriate level of mitigation that I should adopt? And so we've been really having some great interactions and feedback from stakeholders about, developing this framework, and it's really coming along nicely. But if you'd like to talk more about it with me later on, feel free to stop by. I'm happy to do so. But as we have 3 minutes there, why don't we pivot to the fastest ever Q&A that ever was? Could we potentially go a bit longer than 3 minutes if people have questions? Yeah, okay. I don't see anyone rioting at the door. Okay, fantastic. All right, questions, people, show no mercy. We'll try and be kind.
Feel free to come up. Oz is on it today.
My God, now it's gotten flown out of my head. A couple of things. So, actually, go ahead.
Oh, sure. So I see you have the user controls on there. Do you have an example of like what type of guardrails and what type of framework would be processing the data? Like what should stay on-prem, you know what I mean, or like on device, and what should go off? Like, is there a barrier there of like guardrails to separate that, or like how can we do that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so with user controls, there are going to be limits, I'll say at the outset, what kinds of data you can give users control over with respect to like what kinds of things they say I want to share versus I don't want to share. Because I think, as we were alluding to when talking about various kinds of sensor data, you may not be able to use XOR period if I can't have certain sensor data. If you're not giving me access to your camera so that it can be, engaged in, for example, time of flight sensors, coming back to and from the sensor, that thing's not going to work, and you're going to run into a wall, which is not good for anyone. But there are other kinds of data processing, which a company may judge is not necessary to provide a particular experience, and therefore, given potential risks, whether they be legal or policy, they may decide, okay, we're going to let the user, have control over that particular kind of data. That may be, for example, various kinds of gaze-based tracking. I've seen certain companies think about rolling out those kinds of controls. But again, there are limits to that. Yeah.
I think there's also substantial overlap with trust and safety related user concerns and privacy concerns, because oftentimes they serve the same ends. So one example could be, if you look at Meta's teen controls, they have it so that a teen's friend list is not visible externally. That is both privacy protective and protective for a minor. So it's thinking more about the user experience in a comprehensive way, and in a way that allows them to have knowledge of how their data flow is being broadcast out to others. That is a very layperson way to explain that. And it's thinking about what is on by default versus what you have to toggle on and off.
Yeah.
It is always best to have them on by default and have people have to go back to make it less protective than not.
Yeah. Well,
So,
sorry, you go on, please.
yeah. So it sounds like it's quite likely we'll end up in an environment where certain apps and devices may be legal in some states and not in others, at least within the United States. And then also, do they get into the discussion of what is the storage and what is the processing device? Because I can recognize you from your face, and regardless of whether or not a software system can do so.
This is not legal advice, but normally I will tell a client to cater to the most restrictive state law, so to aim for Illinois.
Because that's the one you're going to be sued in.
Yeah. So if you can pass Illinois' laws, you're pretty good, because we don't have an omnibus federal bill.
There's no federal law.
And that's part of the challenge with this at this point, where it puts a lot of burden on businesses to determine whether or not they're how to navigate a minefield with 50 different mines.
Yeah.
Regulators and legislators at this point aren't as savvy about the granularity that you're talking about. And that to me, the work that FBF has been doing is like, is the cloud on the silver lining of that. Where a lot of times when the people who are regulating and legislating these things aren't as familiar with the nuts and bolts of how it actually works. And even if they are educated about data flows and things like that, I've seen lots of malarkey. You can quote me on malarkey. When you're looking at the jurisdiction for potential criminal or civil actions that would touch XR. One example of this, you look at the 144 laws that were proposed this year already, so more are coming, around online child safety. My analysis is that some of them apply to XR contexts, some of them don't, based on the way they have determined what the jurisdiction of the law is. And some are overbroad, like anything that connects to the internet. If I was a judge, that's gone. That's way too broad. You need to make it narrowly tailored and specific to be applicable. But other ones say anything you can create an account on, which I would actually argue discounts Horizon Worlds. You don't create an account there. You use your meta account, and there's no functionality in Horizon Worlds to create a specific account at this point. And they've gone back and forth on that a couple times. But at this point, I would be comfortable making an argument that that's outside the scope.
All right. I think we're about at time, right?
We'll stick around for a little bit if you have more questions.
Yeah, please do. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you,
appreciate your
guys.
time.
Thank you.